The morning she signed the papers, her hands didn't shake. That was the part Nell Hadley would remember longest. Not the smell of the lawyer's office, not the sound of her younger brother trying not to cry in the chair beside her, but the stillness of her own hands as she wrote her name next to Cort Danner's, and became, in the eyes of Harlan County and the state of Texas, his wife. She had not met him before that morning. Her father had, once, 6 years ago, when the Hadley land was still solvent, and Cort Danner was just the name of a rancher 2 counties over who had come to buy a bull. That transaction had gone well. This one was harder to categorize. A debt settled, a family saved, a daughter handed over. Nell preferred not to think of it in those terms. She had a choice, technically. She could have let the bank take the house, the land, the equipment, the livestock. Let her mother finish her recovery in a county facility instead of her own bedroom. Let her brother Owen drop out of his 2nd year at A&M and come home to nothing. She could have done all of that. She chose not to. That was what she told herself, standing outside the lawyer's office in the November cold. Her new husband 3 feet away and already turned toward the truck, already thinking about something else. He was taller than she'd expected. That was the first thing she registered, which said something about the state of her mind, that she was cataloging physical details instead of feeling the enormity of what had just happened. He was tall and broad across the shoulders, and he wore a hat that had seen real weather, not the kind people bought in gift shops. He held the door of the truck for her without making a production of it. She got in. They drove for 40 minutes without speaking. It wasn't hostile silence. That was the strange part. Nell had braced herself for it to be hostile, had been bracing for weeks, ever since her father's attorney had laid out the situation and mentioned Danner's offer as a last resort, something almost apologetic in his voice. She had expected the silence of a man who had purchased something and was already tired of it. What she got instead was the silence of a man who simply didn't fill space with noise he didn't mean. He turned the radio on low, country station, and she watched the landscape shift from town to highway, to red clay back roads she didn't know. The Danner place was called the Crest. She'd learned that from the paperwork, and when the truck turned off the main county road and passed under a cedar post gate with the name carved into it, Nell looked straight ahead and told herself she was not afraid. The house was not what she expected either. She had been imagining something austere, practical, stripped of anything soft. What she found was a porch with 2 chairs on it, a window box still holding the dried stems of something that had been flowers, a kitchen with a good table and afternoon light falling across it in long yellow rectangles. Not a showplace, not a wreck. A house where someone had been living steadily for a long time. "You can put your things in the room at the end of the hall," Cort said. "Second door on the left. There's a bathroom through it that's yours." "Thank you," Nell said. He nodded and went back outside. She stood in the kitchen for a moment alone, and listened to the silence of the house and thought, all right, all right. She had expected him to explain himself. People who did things like this usually wanted some acknowledgement of their generosity, the way they'd framed it, the sacrifice involved, some recognition that they'd been, all things considered, decent about it. Cort Danner explained nothing. He handed her the keys to the 2nd truck on the 3rd morning and said the nearest grocery store was 30 miles, the hardware in the other direction, and that she was free to go wherever she needed to go. Then he went to work. She learned the ranch by walking it. That first week she put on boots and went out in the early mornings when the light was still thin and the frost hadn't lifted from the grass. And she walked the fence lines and the creek bed and the horse pens and the equipment barn, and she watched the men who worked for Cort go about their business. There were 4 of them who lived on the property in a bunkhouse at the north end. They called her ma'am and did not ask her questions. She appreciated that more than she could have said. She also watched how Cort moved through his own land. Not with ownership, exactly, more like stewardship. He checked on things. He noticed things. When one of the mares started favoring her left front leg, he was in the pen with her before any of the hands mentioned it, crouched down with his hand moving carefully from fetlock to knee, his face quiet and focused. He did not make a show of caring. He just did. Nell saw it from the fence and said nothing. At meals they talked about practical things. The weather, the work that needed doing, whether the road down to the south pasture was going to hold after the rain. She asked questions about the cattle operation, and he answered them without condescension, without surprise that she was asking. Once he said, "You know something about grazing rotations," and she told him her grandfather had run a small herd when she was a girl. He nodded like that was useful information and went back to his plate. She found herself paying attention to what he didn't say. Most men she'd known talked around what they wanted, approached things sideways. Cort Danner said what he meant, or he said nothing. When she asked him, one evening over the dishes, why he had made the offer to her father's attorney, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Hadley land adjoins mine on the south side. I'd been watching it go under for 2 years. That was part of it." He rinsed a glass and set it in the rack. "Your father's a good man who got hit by a bad run. I didn't see any reason not to. That wasn't all of it, she knew. But she believed it as far as it went. The thing no one had warned her about was the loneliness, which came not from being alone. She'd always been able to manage solitude, but from being strange to herself. She was Nell Danner now on paper. She was living in a man's house, sleeping in a room down the hall from him, eating at his table, and she didn't know yet who she was inside all of that. The Nell who had driven herself and her brother to UT, and driven herself home again when money ran out, who had worked at the feed store and taken night classes and told herself she was building towards something that Nell felt very far away. She couldn't tell yet if the distance was loss or just change. She called her brother Owen on Tuesday evenings. He was back at school, the tuition paid through the end of his degree. He sounded relieved and guilty in equal measure, and she worked to keep her voice light so he wouldn't hear anything that might weigh on him. Her mother was recovering. That was the anchor. That was the thing she returned to when the November nights stretched out, and the wind came down off the caprock, and the house felt large and unfamiliar. Her mother was recovering, and Owen was in school, and the Hadley land was not lost. Those were facts. Those were real. She tried not to need anything more than that. It was a woman named Dottie Lark who first made Nell understand what people thought about her marriage. Dottie ran the post office and general store in the small town of Tool Fork, and she had the manner of someone who had witnessed every variation of human behavior, and found most of it disappointing. She looked at Nell over the counter for a long moment when Nell introduced herself. "You're Cort Danner's wife," Dottie said, as if verifying a diagnosis. "I am," Nell said. Dottie's expression shifted into something more careful. "He's a fair man," she said after a moment. "Does what he says he'll do. There aren't many like that anymore." It was said as a kind of warning wrapped in a compliment, or maybe a compliment wrapped in a warning. Nell thanked her for it, and bought stamps and drove back to the Crest thinking about fair. Whether fair was something a person could build on. She was beginning to think it was. That same week she found the box. It was in the hall closet, not hidden, just set to the side behind a stack of folded blankets. A cardboard box with the flaps folded shut, a woman's name written on the top in blue ink. Faye. She didn't open it. She pushed it gently back where it was, and closed the closet door and went to start dinner. And she thought about the way Cort had set his jaw once, when one of the hands had made a passing reference to someone she hadn't caught, and the hand had gone quiet fast. She didn't ask. That was something she had decided early. She would not press him into corners. If he wanted her to know something, he would tell her. She was a practical woman who had made a practical arrangement, and she would not complicate it by needing things he hadn't agreed to give. But she filed the name away. Faye. It sat in the back of her mind like a stone she kept turning over and setting down. December came in hard. The temperatures dropped and the work on the ranch didn't stop for it, and Nell found herself falling into the rhythm of the days without meaning to. She fixed things that needed fixing. She started keeping a kitchen garden plan for the spring. She learned the names of the hands. Birch, who was taciturn and skilled with anything mechanical. Dolph, who was young and tried too hard to be helpful. Terence, who had 3 daughters and kept photographs of them above his bunk and talked about them with quiet, steady pride. She learned that Cort woke at 5 every morning and was outside before full light. She learned that he read in the evenings, mostly history, and that he had strong opinions about certain periods of Texas history that he would share, carefully and briefly, if she asked. She learned that he fixed his own fence and didn't delegate anything he wasn't willing to do himself. She had begun to feel something like settled. It frightened her, the ease of it. She didn't trust ease. Then Holbrook showed up. His full name was Holbrook Fenn. She remembered it from the file of names her instinct said to avoid, but she hadn't been told why it mattered, just that names like his had already been used. The version standing in her doorway one December afternoon was real enough. A man in a pressed shirt and good boots, a little older than Cort, with a way of smiling that showed more teeth than warmth. He said he was an old acquaintance, and that he'd heard Cort had married and thought he'd stop by to congratulate them. Cort came in from outside while the man was still standing in the kitchen. Something changed in the room. Not loudly. The temperature didn't drop. No voices were raised. But Nell watched her husband's face go very still in the way she'd come to recognize as controlled, not calm, and she thought, this is someone he does not want in this house. Holbrook, Cort said. Cort. The man smiled wider. And this must be the new wife. He looked at Nell in a way that inventoried her, a brief look, but thorough. She met his eyes and didn't look away. Nell Danner, she said. After Holbrook left, 15 minutes, pleasantries, a coffee he accepted and drank standing up. Cort stood at the window and watched the truck pull out. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Is he someone I should be concerned about? Nell asked. Cort turned from the window. He looked at her for a moment like he was deciding something. He was Faye's uncle, he said. She didn't ask who Faye was. She waited. My first wife, Cort said. She passed 4 years ago. A pause. Holbrook didn't think much of me before she died, and he thinks less of me since. He's been trying to put together a case for something, nothing with any real ground under it. He looked back at the window. I should have told you. I'm sorry I didn't. Nell thought about that for a moment. Thank you for telling me now, she said. He nodded. They finished the evening in the usual way, quietly, and she went to bed and lay in the dark for a while, thinking about a man who had loved someone and lost her, who had carried that loss into a house and kept it in a box in a closet, and who had, for his own reasons, practical and otherwise, offered a young woman a way out of a hard place, and asked almost nothing in return. She wasn't sure what she was feeling exactly. She wasn't sure there was a word for it yet. Holbrook Fenn did not disappear. He was the type of man who preferred persistence to confrontation, or rather, who preferred the kind of persistence that functioned as slow-burning confrontation. In January, he spoke to the county assessor's office, suggesting discrepancies in the property survey that marked the border between the Crest and the Hadley land. In February, there was a letter from an attorney in Amarillo, formal and vague, citing unspecified concerns regarding Faye Danner's estate. Cort read these things at the kitchen table and set them down without visible agitation. Nell read them too, because he showed them to her. That had started in December, after the conversation about Faye. A quiet shift toward including her, toward not managing things around her. She didn't know if it was trust or simply practicality, and she found she didn't need to know. It felt like the same thing. She had opinions about the attorney's letter. She'd taken enough paralegal coursework years ago to recognize language that meant nothing but was designed to intimidate. She said so. Cort looked at her. You know legal language. Some. Enough. She set the letter down. This is a fishing expedition. He's hoping you'll respond with something that gives him a real angle. She paused. Don't respond. Or respond through your own attorney with exactly nothing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I have a meeting with my attorney next week. Come with me. She went. The attorney, a careful woman named Graves who operated out of a small office in Lubbock, looked at Nell with undisguised appraisal. Nell held her gaze and waited. By the end of the meeting, something had shifted in Mrs. Graves's expression. Not warmth, exactly, but something like recalibration. On the drive back, Cort said, You were good in there, Nell said. I was just myself. He glanced at her sidelong, and she thought she saw something around the edges of his expression that she hadn't seen before. She wasn't sure what to name it. She looked back at the road. What happened in March she did not expect. It had nothing to do with Holbrook Fenn or attorneys or property lines. It was a Wednesday evening, ordinary in every outward way, and she was at the kitchen table going over the grazing rotation she'd been drawing up, and Cort was reading, and the radio was on low. A particular song came on, something old and slow, and he reached over without looking up from his book and turned it off. She looked up. He didn't. Later she went to the kitchen for water, and he was already there, standing at the window again, not looking at anything. She filled her glass and stood beside him and looked out at the dark yard. She liked that song, he said. I figured, Nell said. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, I've been wondering if this is fair to you. She turned to look at him. He was still looking out the window. What part of it? She asked. All of it, the arrangement. He paused. You're 26 years old. You should have, Cort. He stopped. "I made a choice," she said. "It was a real choice. I knew what I was choosing." She set her glass down on the counter. "I'm not here because I had no options. I'm here because this was the right one." He looked at her then. She wasn't sure what she meant to say next, but she meant what she'd already said, every word of it. And she let that be enough and went back to her room. She lay awake for longer than she wanted to admit. Spring came the way spring comes in the Texas Panhandle, late and argumentative, a week of warmth, and then a freeze and then warmth again. Nell planted her kitchen garden and lost half of it to a late frost and replanted without making a production of it. Birch stopped by the garden fence one morning and said that she had the right kind of stubbornness for this country. She thanked him and meant it. She had found her footing. She wasn't sure when it had happened, not all at once, but in increments, the way land settles after a heavy rain. She knew the rhythm of the crest now, knew what needed to be done each day, and what could wait, knew how to read the sky in the afternoon and how to read Cort's silence, which was different from how it had been in November and different, again, from what it had been in February. He had changed too, or maybe she was simply seeing more of what had always been there. He left her half a pot of coffee in the mornings because he was always up first. He brought back things from town without being asked. A book she'd mentioned once, wire for the garden fence, a particular brand of hand salve that worked better in dry weather. He never mentioned these things. They simply appeared. She started leaving things for him too. A hat she'd found at the back of the closet that she'd had blocked and cleaned in town, left on the peg by the door. A piece of pie with a note that said the filling came out better than she'd expected. A copy of a county historical survey from the library about Panhandle cattle trails that she thought he'd find interesting, which he read over 2 evenings and left on the table with 2 passages marked. Tool Fork in general had made up its mind about them. Nell heard about it secondhand and directly. Dottie Lark told her over the post office counter one afternoon that people had been skeptical, but they were coming around. "You're not what anyone expected," Dottie said, and it was not a criticism. "Neither is how you are together." Nell thought about that on the drive home, how they were together. She wasn't sure when together had become a word that applied. The evening she drove back from Lubbock alone. Cort had stayed to deal with a situation at the south pasture. She walked in to find that he'd been back before her after all, and left dinner on the stove with a low flame under it, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment and felt something move through her that was uncomplicated and exact. She had not felt that in a long time. She wasn't sure she had ever felt it in exactly this way. The Holbrook Fen situation came to its head in late April. He had managed to get a hearing scheduled in county court. A formal review of the estate claims that his attorney had been building piece by careful piece. The claim was, at its core, simple, that Cort Danner had exerted undue influence over Faye in the months before her death, and that certain assets had been improperly retained rather than transferred to Faye's family trust. It was not a criminal proceeding. It did not need to be. It only needed to be loud enough, public enough, to damage. Cort sat with his attorney, Mrs. Graves, 3 days before the hearing and went through the documentation. Nell sat beside him. She had organized most of it, the records, the correspondence, the timeline built out over 2 evenings from whatever she could gather. Mrs. Graves looked at the timeline and then at Nell. "You prepared this?" "Yes." A pause. "This is thorough. It's accurate," Nell said. "That's what matters." In the hearing room on a Tuesday morning, Nell sat in the second row and watched her zoo questions in front of the county judge with the same steadiness he brought to everything. No performance, no anger, just a man who had nothing to hide speaking plainly about what was true. He talked about Faye. He talked about the last years of their marriage, and the last months of her life, and the way the estate had been handled and why. His voice didn't change. He didn't look for sympathy. Nell watched the judge. She watched the way the room shifted as Cort spoke. When it was her turn, she had requested to speak, over mild objection from Holbrook's attorney. She walked to the front and stated clearly that she had reviewed the documentation herself, that the timeline bore out her husband's account in every verifiable particular, and that the claim before the court represented, in her assessment, a campaign of harassment built on grief that had curdled into something else. She said it without heat. She said it looking at the judge, not at Holbrook. Holbrook's attorney objected. The judge noted the objection. The judge then noted that the documentation was, in fact, thorough and consistent, and that the evidentiary basis for the claim was insufficient. The hearing ended. Outside on the courthouse steps, Cort stood beside her in the April light. He didn't say anything for a moment. The sky was wide and pale, and there was a wind coming from the northwest that still had cold in it. "You didn't have to do that. I know," she said. He looked at her, and there was something in his expression she had not seen before, or maybe had not let herself see before. Open in a way he did not usually allow, something careful set aside. "Nell," he said. "I know," she said again, quieter. They stood there for another moment. The wind moved through the cedar at the edge of the parking lot, and the courthouse clock marked the hour, and somewhere behind them the door opened and closed on someone else's business. She thought about the first morning, the stillness of her own hands, the drive through country she didn't know yet, the silence that was not hostile, the kitchen with the good light. She thought about what she had chosen and why. "Let's go home," she said. He put his hand briefly at the small of her back, nothing more than that, a gesture so quiet she might have missed it. She didn't miss it. On the drive back to the crest, she watched the land open up around them, the red clay and the cedar and the long, flat reach of the panhandle sky, and she thought, "I didn't know I was looking for something." She had thought she was only surviving. She had thought she was making the best of a closed door. She had not known there was a window. Cort drove the way he did everything, steadily, without wasted motion. The radio was off. The land went on in every direction. She had signed her name next to his 5 months ago with steady hands and told herself it was a practical decision, a real one made with clear eyes. She had not been wrong. She had just not known yet all that she was deciding. She knew now. She looked out the window at the wide country that was hers now too, for reasons that had started as practical and become something else entirely, and she let herself feel the full, unhurried weight of that. The knowledge that the place you end up is not always where you expected to go, and that unexpected does not mean wrong. The truck turned under the cedar post gate. The crest lay ahead in the afternoon light, ordinary and solid and entirely itself, and Nell Danner went home.